It was the kind of night that never seemed to end. A thin mist curled along the edges of the streetlights, throwing pale halos against the cracked sidewalks of a small town in northern Illinois. The year was recent enough that cell phones and surveillance cameras were everywhere, but old enough that many corners of this town still felt frozen in time-dim diners with neon signs, rusted gas stations, and neighborhoods where everyone claimed to know everyone else. Detective Michael Harris was not the kind of man who usually went missing. He was, by reputation, one of the most persistent detectives in the county. A tall figure with a sharp jaw and weathered skin, he had spent over 15 years with the department, developing a name for himself as the man who could crack cases that nobody else wanted to touch. The last anyone had heard, he was knee-deep in a difficult murder investigation involving a local contractor found bludgeoned in his garage. It wasn't just another homicide. It was politically sensitive. The victim had ties to city officials, and whispers of corruption had been floating around for weeks. On the night of his disappearance, Harris left the precinct at 9:47 p.m., according to the security log. He signed out some files, grabbed a cup of coffee from the vending machine downstairs, and told the night sergeant he was going to check on something before heading home. That was the last verifiable moment anyone could place him. The next morning, his unmarked Ford Taurus was discovered, abandoned, the parking lot of an old shopping center off Route 41. The lot was half empty, surrounded by boarded-up storefronts and overgrown weeds that had crept up through the cracks in the pavement. The driver's side door was unlocked, and inside the vehicle were his badge, his service weapon still holstered, and his cell phone resting on the passenger seat. The strangest part was that the car was spotless to clean. There were no fingerprints, not even Harris's. Forensics couldn't lift anything off the wheel, the dash, or the handles. It was as if someone had carefully wiped the entire vehicle. Before leaving it there, the department initially tried to keep the situation quiet. A detective vanishing in the middle of an open homicide investigation was not something they wanted the press running wild with. But rumors spread quickly. Officers whispered in break rooms. Clerks at the courthouse speculated. And within 48 hours, the local news stations had the story. Neighbors of Harris said they last saw him earlier that week, coming home late, sometimes after midnight. He lived alone in a modest two-story house in a quiet cul-de-sac. His lawn was neatly trimmed, blinds always drawn. A widow 2 doors down recalled seeing his porch light on past 2 a.m. the night he disappeared. 10, but when she looked again, closer to 3. It was dark. When investigators went through his house, they were struck by its orderliness. Every item seemed carefully arranged, books alphabetized on a shelf, shoes lined up near the door, mail stacked neatly on the counter. But in his study, they found something that unsettled even the most seasoned officers. Harris's desk had been cleared, except for a single yellow legal pad with handwritten notes. The notes detailed aspects of the contractor's murder investigation, names of individuals Harris had interviewed, connections between the victim and city contracts, and a list of phone numbers. At the bottom of the page, written in a hurried scrawl, were the words, "They're watching me. Can't trust anyone." No one knew who they were. The investigation into Harris's disappearance turned into a frenzy. Local officers scoured wooded areas, rivers, abandoned warehouses. Federal agencies were briefly contacted, but it wasn't clear if this was an abduction, a voluntary disappearance, or something stranger. The lack of evidence made it worse. There were no signs of struggle in his home, no surveillance footage of anyone near his car, no credit card or bank activity. It was as if he'd simply walked off the face of the earth. Still, there were fragments of strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to his vanishing. A clerk at a downtown diner recalled Harris sitting alone at the counter 2 nights before he disappeared, staring at the door more than eating his food. When asked if everything was all right, he muttered something about things not adding up and paid in cash. Another officer, who had partnered with him briefly, remembered Harris insisting that his phone had been tampered with. He said he was hearing clicks during calls, pauses before people spoke, and once, in the middle of a conversation, his phone emitted a high-pitched tone before going dead. Even stranger was a report from a gas station attendant on Route 41. He claimed that on the very night Harris vanished, just after 10 p.m., a man matching Harris's description came in to pay for gas, but the station's security footage for that entire evening had been corrupted, displaying only static. The police examined the hard drive, but their digital forensics unit couldn't recover a single usable frame. Harris wasn't the kind of man to walk away from his life. He was disciplined, dedicated to his work. Yet, the deeper colleagues dug, the more it seemed he had been carrying a private weight. His sister later revealed that Harris had called her just 3 days before, sounding unusually tense. He told her, "If something happens to me, don't believe the first story they tell." She asked him to explain, but he quickly changed the subject, insisting he was just tired. In the weeks that followed, the department launched an official task force. Butt cracks were already forming in the narrative. Some officers were convinced he had uncovered something dangerous in the contractor's murder case. Others thought he might have been targeted because he refused to play along with certain political favors. Still, a quieter group whispered a darker theory that Harris hadn't been taken at all, that he had staged his own disappearance. But the problem with that theory was the legal pad. Those words, "They're watching me, can't trust anyone," didn't sound like the beginning of a new life. They sounded like a warning. Detective Harris's name became a ghost in town. His picture stayed pinned to the wall of the precinct, surrounded by maps and notes, as if the department was trying to will him back by keeping him present. His disappearance began to overshadow the very case he had been working on. The contractor's murder faded into the background, while everyone focused on the detective who had gone missing in plain sight. Weeks turned into months, and every lead collapsed into silence. But one fact remained undeniable. The last person to investigate the murder of the contractor was the very man who vanished without a trace. And some believed that was no coincidence. The missing detective's shadow hung over everyone. Neighbors stopped letting their kids roam too far after dark. Officers glanced over their shoulders more often, wondering if Harris's paranoia about being watched had been justified. The town itself seemed quieter, as if everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop, and though no one admitted it out loud, more than a few believed that Harris hadn't just stumbled onto something dangerous, he had been silenced for it. The morning fog lingered over the town like a persistent shadow, muffling sound and blurring the edges of reality. Officers canvassing neighborhoods had begun to notice subtle details they had overlooked before. Doors that were slightly ajar, windows with blinds disturbed despite no one living there, and footprints in damp soil that didn't match any known residents. Every clue seemed to circle back to Harris. It provided no answers. Detective Laura Simmons was assigned as the lead on the missing detective case. She had worked with Harris on previous investigations and knew him well enough to sense that this disappearance was unlike anything he would orchestrate himself. Laura had a meticulous mind. She refused to accept coincidences. She went through Harris's files in his house with gloved hands, examining everything: documents, notebooks, even the tiniest scraps of paper he might have discarded. There was a pattern emerging, subtle but undeniable. Harris had been tracking 3 key individuals connected to the contractor's business: Stealings, a mid-level city council member, a private investigator who had worked for corporate clients, and a man known in local circles for laundering money through shell companies. All 3 names were underlined in his notes, circled repeatedly, sometimes accompanied by cryptic annotations like "watch the phone" or "meet before midnight." Laura took the notes to the precinct and laid them out across the conference table. Her partner, Detective Raul Ortega, leaned over, squinting at the scribbles. "This looks like he was onto something bigger than the murder itself," Ortega said, tapping one of the pages. "I mean, This isn't just a contractor. These names, they're connected to politics, to city contracts, maybe even organized money. Laura nodded. Exactly. And whoever these people are, they probably knew Harris was digging. That explains why he disappeared without a trace. She paused, her finger tracing the words Harris had written on the last page. They're watching me. Can't trust anyone. He was careful, but not paranoid without reason. This was more than a gut feeling. Investigators decided to reconstruct Harris's last known movements using every tool available. They checked phone pings, credit card activity, license plate readers, and CCTV footage. But every lead was frustratingly thin. The only tangible clue was a single receipt found in Harris's car diner on the outskirts of town he had visited. The night he vanished, the receipt indicated he had paid in cash, yet a timestamp showed the diner had closed 30 minutes earlier than the purchase time. Laura decided to visit the diner herself. The place smelled faintly of burnt coffee and fried eggs, and the manager was an older man with a nervous demeanor. Detective Harris, Laura asked. You knew him? The man nodded slowly. Yeah. Came by a couple nights ago. He was quiet, kept looking over his shoulder. Paid cash, like he didn't want a trace. Funny thing, the clock in the kitchen broke that night. No one noticed the time. Might explain the timestamp. Or maybe, he trailed off, shaking his head. Maybe it was just him being careful. Laura took notes, sensing the hesitation in the man's voice. People in small towns often remember more than they admit at first, and she could tell he was holding back something. She pressed gently. Did he mention anyone? Someone he was worried about. The manager hesitated again. He mentioned something about the contractor, and he said he didn't trust the people around him. That's all I know. Back at the precinct, Laura and Ortega worked late into the night, cross-referencing Harris's notes with municipal records, surveillance footage, and bank transactions. The more they dug, the more complex the web became. The contractor had been involved in numerous city contracts, many of which were tied to shady shell companies, and each name on Harris's notes had overlapping financial footprints, phone records, and meeting logs. Around midnight, Laura made a call she hadn't wanted to make, yet she reached out to Harris's sister. She needed to understand the man he had been in the final days before disappearing. Did he seem frightened? Laura asked gently. Yeah, his sister admitted. He called me 3 days before. Said people were watching him. Said if something happened, don't trust what you hear. He sounded tense, different, like someone had just shoved a storm in his chest and told him to carry it alone. Laura jotted this down and hung up, her mind racing. Harris wasn't just missing, he was being hunted, and the things he had uncovered were dangerous enough that he couldn't trust anyone, not even his closest colleagues. The next day, a new lead came in. A hiker found a black notebook in the woods, roughly half a mile from where Harris's car had been left. The notebook had pages ripped from the spine, but a few entries remained. They were frantic, written in short bursts, detailing encounters, phone calls, and shadowy figures he suspected were following him. One page mentioned a location repeatedly, an abandoned warehouse near the industrial district, with the note check before they find me. Laura and Ortega went to the warehouse. The air inside smelled of mildew and rust, the floor littered with broken glass and scattered papers. Among the debris, they found signs of recent activity: sleeping bag, a half-eaten sandwich, and some clothing items, all worn but intact. There was no trace of Harris himself, but the evidence suggested he had been there, possibly hiding. Ortega frowned. So he was alive, at least for a little while after disappearing. But why leave all this behind? It's like he wanted us to find something. Maybe a trail? Laura nodded. Or maybe he was desperate. Look at the handwriting, the notes. He was terrified, but he had a plan. He knew someone was after him. As they gathered the evidence, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Every creak of the warehouse floor, every shadow flickering across the walls felt deliberate. She scanned the area but saw nothing, just the silence of a place abandoned long ago. Driving back to the precinct, she said aloud, more to herself than to Ortega, "Harris didn't just vanish. He went off-grid for a reason. And whatever he found, it's bigger than a murder. Much bigger." Ortega remained quiet, a frown etched deep on his face. "I hope we find him before it's too late." Hours later, in a dimly lit room somewhere unknown, a figure moved silently. Papers, maps, and photographs littered the walls, connected by strings of yarn. A single lamp cast harsh light on a desk covered in evidence, and in the center, a photograph of Harris. He wasn't in it, but the notes were meticulously arranged. Whoever had been tracking him was methodical, patient, meticulous, someone who knew exactly how Harris thought. Somewhere deep in the city, Detective Harris's story was far from over. And though he had vanished from the public eye, as a game he had been playing, the investigation, the uncovering of dangerous secrets, was only just beginning. The days stretched into weeks. But Harris's absence became more than just a missing person. Casey began to feel like a specter haunting the town. Every lead the police chased seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. Files went missing from the precinct's archive room. Surveillance footage was corrupted without explanation, and even officers reported strange, fleeting sightings of a man who looked like Harris in unlikely places, walking along highways at dawn, standing outside closed businesses at midnight, but by the time anyone approached, he was gone. Detective Laura Simmons felt the weight of it more than anyone. Her desk was cluttered with maps, post-it notes, and photos of Harris's last known movements. She had a system to track anomalies, city contracts, phone pings, security footage, even the sporadic sightings. She began to notice patterns and inconsistencies. For example, every time a lead pointed to someone connected to the contractor's network, something inexplicable happened. A hard drive would fail. An interviewee would recant their statement. A witness would suddenly disappear. One evening, Laura was going through Harris's phone backups, the few that could be recovered from cloud servers. Among mundane contacts and past call logs, there was a single folder labeled Private, Do Not Open. Inside were encrypted messages. She worked through hours of decoding, revealing short texts, fragmented emails, and voice memos. Many were truncated, distorted, but one voice memo stood out. Harris's voice, tense, whispering into the microphone. "They know. They're everywhere. Can't let them find the papers. If anything happens, trust no one." The recording ended abruptly, leaving silence heavier than words. Laura played it again and again, trying to catch background noises, any hint of location. There was a faint hum, like machinery, or perhaps ventilation. She wrote it down, but it led nowhere immediately. Meanwhile, small anomalies began to appear in the city. Street cameras caught fleeting shadows that didn't match any passerby. Local residents reported unmarked vans parked overnight near their homes. And then came the anonymous tips calls to the precinct with no voice on the other end. Texts sent from blocked numbers containing only coordinates or the single word, "Watch." Laura and Ortega followed one of these tips to a derelict section of the industrial district. Rusting factories loomed overhead, and the air was thick with the smell of chemicals and decay. The tip had given them a warehouse number, 47B. Inside, dust hung in the air like fog. Broken machinery and old crates filled the space. But in the center, illuminated by a shaft of light from a broken window, was a stack of cardboard boxes, carefully arranged. Inside the top box were Harris's notes, neatly organized into folders. His handwriting was precise, deliberate. Every detail recorded interviews, phone numbers, dates, and possible corruption links. One folder contained the names of every official connected to the contractor's shady dealings. Another held diagrams of financial transactions, and in a smaller envelope, marked "If I Vanish," wire instructions on how to continue his investigation. Laura picked up the envelope, her heart pounding. He expected this. He wanted someone to find this, she said. Ortega nodded silently, but neither of them spoke, the question looming over both of them. Why had he disappeared? The warehouse yielded more than just papers. There were signs that someone or Harris himself had been living there for weeks. A makeshift sleeping area in the corner, a kettle, and a few canned foods. Even a small stack of newspapers carefully hidden under a crate. It was clear Harris had chosen to disappear deliberately, but the meticulous care suggested urgency, fear, and paranoia all at once. As they documented the scene, Laura's phone buzzed. It was an anonymous text. "You're close. Stop now, or you'll vanish too." Okay. She froze, staring at the screen. Ortega took the phone, analyzing the number. "Untraceable," he muttered. "No carrier, no record. Whoever this is, they know exactly what they're doing." Laura pocketed her phone and looked around the warehouse. The evidence was enough to blow the investigation wide open. Yet, it also confirmed Harris's fears. Someone was watching, manipulating, and controlling the flow of information. Every step forward carried risk. Back at the precinct, Laura organized the files into a secure folder on an isolated server. The goal was clear: piece together the contractor's murder, track the corruption, and somehow find Harris. But every methodical step felt like walking a tightrope over a pit whose depth no one could measure. That night, Laura dreamed of Harris. He was always just out of reach, walking through foggy streets, disappearing behind corners, always leaving messages that she could only partially understand. She awoke with the taste of iron on her tongue, her heart pounding. It was as if he was telling her something, a warning or a plea. She couldn't tell which. A new lead emerged, a series of encrypted emails sent from an address linked to the contractor's shell companies. They referenced Harris directly, noting deadlines and movements as if tracking him in real time. Laura worked feverishly to decrypt them, covering fragments of communication between the city council member and unknown accomplices. The content was chilling: instructions, warnings, and veiled threats. Harris's disappearance wasn't a random act, it was orchestrated, precise, and personal. Laura realized something profound. The detective hadn't simply vanished. He had entered a shadow network of power, corruption, and fear. And now, to save him, or at least understand what had happened, she would have to follow him into that shadow, wherever it might lead. Hours later, late into the night, the precinct's phone rang. The operator answered, and a hushed, distorted voice said only, "She's looking too closely. Stop, or you'll be next." Laura set the receiver down slowly. She stared at the wall, lined with Harris's photos and notes. Somewhere out there, he was alive, or at least, he had been leaving breadcrumbs for her. But the more she chased, the more dangerous it became. The hunter had become the hunted, Kana, and the lines between pursuit and peril were blurring. Outside, Kana picked up, carrying with it the faint echo of footsteps on empty streets. Somewhere, Harris was moving, planning, waiting, and the story of his disappearance, his warnings, his notes, his fear was far from over. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of day where the sky feels like a low ceiling pressing down on everything below. Laura sat at her desk, staring at the maps and notes sprawled across the surface. She had gone through every file from the warehouse multiple times, yet the picture remained incomplete. Every lead seemed to split into another labyrinth. And every pattern, she thought, she had deciphered dissolved the moment she followed it. The precinct's usual hum was muted. Rumors about Harris's disappearance had seeped into the department itself. Some officers whispered that he had uncovered something too dangerous, something involving high-ranking city officials and criminal enterprises no one dared name. Others insisted Harris had staged it, gone off-grid, to protect himself while continuing the investigation in secret. Laura had no doubt he was careful enough to survive, But how careful could one man be when everyone was watching? Laura's phone buzzed with an encrypted message she hadn't seen before. She hesitated, then unlocked it. It was a string of GPS coordinates, time-stamped late last night, with a simple message. He left a trace. Follow it. Ortega leaned over her shoulder. Another breadcrumb? He asked. Laura nodded, her mind racing. Yes, and this one might actually lead us closer to him. Whoever he's leaving these for wants someone competent to follow. They prepared quickly. A nondescript SUV, equipment, phones, cameras, the works. Laura knew Harris had always valued thoroughness. Said he was leaving traces. He had thought of everything. The coordinates led them out of the city, into a series of abandoned industrial roads lined with overgrown weeds and shuttered factories. Eventually, they arrived at a chain-link fence, rusted but still standing, surrounding an old shipping yard. The lot was littered with crates and empty pallets, shadows stretching long in the early morning light. Laura signaled Ortega to proceed slowly. Every step they took was measured, deliberate. Inside the yard, the ground was uneven, scattered with broken glass and discarded machinery. And then they saw it a narrow path, flattened as if someone had walked through recently. Footprints, faint but unmistakable, led toward a massive warehouse at the far end. Laura's heart raced. Harris had been here. Someone had been here. The notes, the footprints, the organized chaos, it all matched the precision she had come to associate with him. They approached the warehouse cautiously. The door was ajar. Inside, dust motes danced in thin shafts of light. The space was immense, filled with pallets, machinery, and signs of recent activity. And in the center, on a metal table, was a laptop. Laura knelt and examined it. The screen displayed a spreadsheet of numbers, financial transactions linked to city officials, shell companies, and the contractor's previous business dealings. Another encrypted file sat open, a map marked with multiple points across the city, each location corresponding to phone pings and sightings. Harris had been creating a network of information, a trail of breadcrumbs in case something happened to him. Ortega's voice was low, almost a whisper. This is a gold mine, but also dangerous. Whoever did this, whoever is watching, could be tracking us even now. Laura nodded, her mind running through every possibility. Harris had disappeared for a reason. He had been meticulous, anticipating threats, leaving instructions for anyone who followed. But the deeper they went into his network of clues, the more apparent it became. The conspiracy was bigger than any single person, bigger than just a murder. A sudden noise made them freeze, a faint metallic clink from the far corner of the warehouse. Shadows shifted, and for a moment, Laura swore she saw a figure dart past one of the stacks. Ortega raised his flashlight, sweeping the area. "Hello?" he called, his voice steady but tense. "This is the police. We're looking for Detective Harris." The warehouse returned only silence, but the air felt charged, electric. The sense of being watched was almost palpable. Every instinct Laura had screamed at her that Harris had been close, very close, and that whoever had forced him into hiding was still operating somewhere nearby. They continued through the warehouse, finding more clues, scraps of paper, hastily drawn diagrams, and another yellow legal pad with scrawled notes. One passage caught Laura's eye. "They're closer than I think. Trust no one. Follow the plan. Leave a trail only someone like Laura can follow. If I vanish completely, she'll know where to start." Laura felt a chill. Harris had planned this carefully. He had anticipated that someone heard would be the one following his trail. And in that moment, she realized that finding him wasn't just about rescuing a missing detective. It was about stepping into a dangerous game, one he had already started, and she was now forced to continue. As they prepared to leave the warehouse with the laptop and notes, Laura felt a sudden sense of urgency. Harris's disappearance wasn't random. Every move, every message, every footprint he left behind was part of a larger design. Someone had wanted him out of the picture, and now she had to enter the shadows he had navigated alone, armed only with his clues, his warnings, and the faint hope that he was still alive. The sun rose higher, cutting through the fog that had lingered all morning. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the silent war unfolding in the shadows. Somewhere in the labyrinth of streets, warehouses, and abandoned lots, Harris was out there, leaving breadcrumbs for those willing to follow. Laura looked at Ortega. We have to find him, and we have to be smarter than they are. Every second counts. Ortega nodded grimly. Then let's follow the trail. And with that, the hunt truly began. The city at night was a different creature. Streetlights flickered against puddles left from an afternoon rain, casting distorted reflections across the asphalt. The quiet hum of traffic mixed with distant sirens, a background symphony for the chase that had just begun. Laura and Ortega moved carefully through the industrial district. The laptop from the warehouse secured in a reinforced case, and Harris's notes clutched in her other hand. Every step felt deliberate. Every shadow potentially hiding eyes that had been tracking them all along. The GPS data extracted from Harris's laptop led them to a series of safe houses he had used during the last weeks before disappearing. Each location was abandoned now, stripped clean except for subtle signs that someone had been there recently. A cigarette butt in a planter, an empty bottle of water, footprints and dust. Harris had covered his tracks with meticulous care, leaving only faint traces for someone determined enough to follow. Laura paused at the entrance to one warehouse, her flashlights sweeping across the space. The air was thick with dust and the metallic tamps of rusted machinery. In the corner, she noticed something unusual. A small pile of papers, neatly stacked and tied with string. She approached cautiously, Ortega close behind. The papers were new, containing messages, diagrams, and phone numbers clearly left recently. Laura's pulse quickened. Harris had been here not long ago. Among the notes was a message written in his precise handwriting. If you're reading this, it means they are watching. Trust no one completely. Every path you follow may lead to a trap, but there's a pattern. Follow it carefully. Ortega frowned. This is sophisticated. He knew exactly how to manipulate whoever was watching him and whoever might try to rescue him. Laura nodded, her mind racing. Harris had essentially left them a puzzle. Each step forward would bring them closer to him, but also closer to danger. She realized the complexity of the situation. Whoever had forced Harris into hiding had extensive resources, knowledge of the city, and surveillance capabilities that were almost impossible to evade. As they continued searching, Laura found a small USB drive hidden under one of the pallets. It contained encrypted video files. She hesitated before opening the first one. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. Harris, moving cautiously through the city streets, sometimes talking into a concealed recorder, sometimes disappearing behind alleyways and shadows. He appeared paranoid but resolute, carefully noting locations, phone numbers, and people who might pose a threat. One clip made Laura freeze. Harris's voice, clear despite the background noise, said, "If anyone finds this, do not trust the police entirely. There are people inside the system helping them. You'll need to be precise, methodical, and prepared to face threats you cannot see." Laura's stomach tightened. Harris had anticipated betrayal from within the system itself. This wasn't just about the contractor's murder anymore. It was a sprawling network of corruption, secrecy, and danger that no ordinary investigation could penetrate. Hours passed as they traced the clues across the city. Each new location revealed more of Harris's careful planning. He had been moving almost invisibly, using abandoned buildings, decoy vehicles, and coded messages to stay one step ahead of those pursuing him. But as Laura pieced together his pattern, it became clear that his vanishing was not merely defensive, it was strategic. Harris had chosen the shadows to gather evidence, identify threats, and create a trail only someone capable of following could navigate late into the night. They arrived at a quiet residential area on the outskirts of the city. The GPS data and Harris's notes indicated a final locational, small, unassuming house. Every instinct told Laura this was the culmination of Harris's careful planning. She motioned for Ortega to stay back as she approached the door. The house was dark, the blinds drawn, but a faint light flickered inside. Laura stepped closer, her hand on her holster. She could feel her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Every instinct screamed caution. Then she heard it, a familiar voice, low and tense, muttering to itself. "Harris." She called softly, her voice steady but urgent. The figure inside froze. A moment later, a door opened, and Detective Michael Harris emerged, gaunt but alert. His eyes were wary, scanning every corner as if expecting an ambush. Laura felt a rush of relief and fear at once. He was alive, but clearly had been through a lot. "Harris, we've been following your trail," Laura said carefully. "We have your notes, your files, everything you left behind. We can help." Harris studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I know," he said, voice strained but resolute. "But it's far from over. They're still out there, and they'll come after anyone who tries to expose them. You've got to understand. This isn't just a murder investigation. It's much bigger." Laura's stomach tightened again. She had suspected as much, but hearing him confirm it made the danger tangible. Harris took a deep breath and began to explain the network he had uncovered: financial corruption, political manipulation, and people embedded in law enforcement itself. Every name he mentioned, every connection he revealed, added another layer of risk. Ortega glanced at Laura, the concern clear in his eyes. "So, we've got the detective back, but we're walking into a minefield." Harris nodded. "Exactly. And every step must be precise. They've been patient, watching, waiting. But now, it's time to finish what I started. Carefully, methodically, without leaving a trace." Laura realized the gravity of what they were about to undertake. Harris's disappearance had been a crucible, testing patience, observation, and resilience. Now, with them back, the challenge was to navigate a shadow network of corruption while keeping themselves alive as the night deepened outside. The three of them gathered the materials Harris had left behind. Each piece of evidence, every clue, was a weapon in a careful strategy. They would move forward cautiously, where that one mistake could undo everything. Somewhere in the darkened city, unseen eyes followed them, noting their every move. The game was far from over, and as Laura, Ortega, and Harris prepared to confront the network, they knew one thing for certain. The shadows that had hidden Harris were patient, intelligent, and relentless. And now they had to be even smarter. The days that followed were tense and methodical. Harris, Laura, and Ortega moved carefully, never staying in one location too long, always aware that someone was tracking their moves. Harris had become a shadow, a strategist who had learned to anticipate every surveillance measure, every potential betrayal. He taught Laura and Ortega how to read patterns in seemingly random activity, how to notice subtle signals in streets, in phone messages, even in the body language of people who seemed innocent. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A mid-level council official, previously considered untouchable, made a careless call late one evening. Harris had been monitoring a network of encrypted communications, and when that call occurred, it revealed the link between the contractor's murder, shell companies, and a series of illicit financial transfers. The evidence was overwhelming, but obtaining it required extreme caution. The team knew that anyone attempting to move openly could be watched. Harris devised a plan. They would create a controlled leak, feeding false information to the corrupt network while securing incontrovertible proof. Laura and Ortega were skeptical at first, but the clarity of his strategy left no room for doubt. Over the next week, they executed it with precision. Every step, every movement was calculated. On the final night, Harris instructed them to monitor a secluded warehouse near the docks. Through surveillance cameras they had covertly installed, they observed a meeting between key players in the network. Faces were captured, documents exchanged, and whispered agreements recorded. Every piece of evidence Harris had painstakingly assembled over months fell into place. The conspiracy was fully exposed. Officials, private enforcers, and criminal intermediaries, all implicated. Laura called the district attorney. The operation was swift. Raids were coordinated. Arrests were made, and the corrupt network collapsed under the weight of its own exposure. The contractor's murder was solved not just as a criminal case, but as part of a broader web of corruption that had been hidden for years. After the chaos, Harris finally allowed himself a moment of relief. He had vanished, yes, but not to abandon justice. He had disappeared to protect the investigation, to survive long enough to bring the truth to light. Laura and Ortega watched as he sat quietly, exhausted but composed. A man who had outmaneuvered an invisible enemy. In the weeks that followed, Harris's disappearance was officially closed. The town began to recover its sense of normalcy, though whispers of the detective who had vanished and returned always lingered. Laura returned to the precinct with a new respect for the shadows Harris had navigated, understanding that justice sometimes required patience, cunning, and courage beyond the ordinary. In Harris, he returned to the life he had almost lost, a quiet presence once more. But he remained vigilant, knowing that the shadows never truly vanished, they only waited. And should corruption rise again, he would be ready. The story of the missing detective ended not with disappearance, but with triumph, resilience, and a subtle reminder that even in the darkest corners, truth could find a way to survive.